Good morning.
Good morning.
So this is talk 2 on Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva Way. And this is something that I studied a lot when I was younger at Tassajara, and younger when I first started practicing for a few years. Anyway, and I studied chapter 6, which is about cultivating patience. So the first verse in chapter 6, let me read it to you. Whatever wholesome deeds, such as venerating the Buddhas and generosity that have been amassed over 100,000 eons, will all be destroyed in one moment of anger. So this is pretty heavy statement. So I've taught this before a couple times over the years, this chapter, and everybody is very distressed about this first verse. So distressed about it that they may decide, forget it. What's the point of me even bothering to continue to do the practice? Especially if they start out with chapter 6, because the chapters that preceded some of them are really quite lovely. And it's unfortunate because the instructions in chapter 6 are that Shantideva gives about cultivating patience they're very practical, they're very methodical, and they're helpful in developing skillful responses in difficult situations. Because put the anchor part aside, no matter what it is that is preventing you from actually being present for a situation, patience is always helpful. So cultivating patience is really good. So sometimes people think, well, it's like, well, I have to tell you, I had a student one time who said, well, oh, this chapter is about figuring out how to be angry. No, this chapter is not about figuring out how to be angry. This chapter is about cultivating patience. And I would also add that if you don't perceive yourself as being a person who has a problem with anger, it does not exempt you from cultivating patience. So that's also something I want to remind you of, and that I'm going to try as much as possible to interpret what Shantideva is saying in this chapter to apply to whatever may be getting in the way of you having skillful communications and engaging in skillful response. So, and again, which I talked about, I think maybe in the Q&A last time, in Buddhism, we say there's greed, hate, and delusion, usually those three things. So greed has to do with not getting enough, right? Hatred or anger has to do with pushing away. So greed is about, I want more, I want more. Anger usually in their response is to say no and push away. And then delusion, the response is to just not do anything. So now often we think of delusion as being in delusion about the nature of reality. But in this particular case, it refers to this notion of delusion being kind of apathy, torpor. So those of you who are in the Buddhism 101 class, we talked a little bit about the Pali Canon and its different parts. And one of them is called the Visuddhimagga, which is a kind of guide, compilation, collection about how to practice using the Buddha's teaching, the earliest Buddhist teaching. And it was interesting. I went through there the other day and looked at the number of times it talked about anger, and it never talked about anger without also talking about greed and delusion. So these three things go together. And most of us have some particular way of protecting ourselves that has to do predominantly with one of these things. Like we might tend to be just to use a kind of well-worn example, we might get upset, and so our idea of dealing with it is to go shopping. So that I would say that was be agreed type. If I want to feel better, I go have more. I go eat ice cream. So, and then the aversion, it would be like, if I want to feel better, I push everything away, get away from me. I don't want to deal with this. Go away. And then the delusional part is, I'm not here. I didn't see that. No, I'm not aware that's happening around me. So there's this, and we all cycle through all of these states of mind, but we might have one in particular that is problematic for us. I would say that the baseline, of course, of all of these, which we don't talk about that much in Buddhism, is fear. Fear for the self. So that is the baseline, I would say, of how we develop these mechanisms for trying to protect ourselves. Okay, so I just want to talk about, try as much as possible to talk about this chapter on patience in a way in which all of us can benefit from this. Okay, but first, to get past this first verse, I want to talk about the meaning of the first verse. So even when Shantideva wrote this down in the 8th century, it's problematic. People have been, scholars, Buddhist scholars and philosophers have been trying to parse this in a way that made it more palatable almost ever since it was written. But Shantideva himself, there were antecedents to this teaching that he gave. And here's an example of one. One moment of hating a bodhisattva destroys the virtues arising from giving and ethics accumulated for hundreds of eons. Thus, there can be no worse sin than impatience. So here, the person is saying, if you get mad at a bodhisattva, you're a deep doo-doo. But, in Shantideva, it's more if you just get angry, period, you've got a problem. But this is, there are several examples of these kinds of verses. And the other thing to remember is we've been talking about is Shantideva came from a different school of Buddhism from the 8th century than Zen. Now, Guide to the Bodhisattva Way is used a lot in Tibetan Buddhism. It's a major text in Tibetan Buddhism. And so they've been talking about this for quite a while. And one of the contemporary commentaries on this, his name is Kunzang Paul Den. He wrote a book called, I wrote it down here. He wrote a commentary on Guide to the Bodhisattva Way. And in that commentary, he talks about this verse. And he's part of the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism. So here he discusses the various understanding of the verse. But where he ends up landing is he says, anger cannot destroy the merit that accumulates from the practice of the paramitas. Okay, so now we're talking about the paramitas. And since generosity, ethics, and venerating the Buddhas are all part of the paramitas, what is disrupted is whether one can accumulate virtue of one's actions, such as helping someone or doing some other generous deed, not one's ability for future good deeds. Okay, so again, what he's saying is that it has to do with whether you can accumulate the virtue of your action of generosity, helping someone, etc., not your ability to be able to do this in the future. So here we have the sense that transformation is possible, that it's in that moment of anger, or here I'm using all three places, anger, delusion, whatever. In that moment, you're being blocked from being able to, here in this case, receive the merit of skillful actions, but in actuality, it does not block you permanently from being able to do this in the future. Now, Pema Chodron wrote a commentary on Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva Way called No Time to Lose. And here she said, the verse applies to anger we don't regret and that we actually justify. So that's interesting. that all of us, but anger is a particular, like I used to say, well, about being angry, it's not that I'm angry, I'm right. Okay, so it's like, I'm right, and that means that's that kind of, I don't regret it and I justify it because I'm right, so therefore it's okay for me. So I'm not angry, I'm just right. And that was what I think she's talking about here. But we could also say the same thing about greed. We could say, yeah, I'm greedy, but I deserve it, or yeah, I'm sorry, I'm checked out, but I'm having a bad day. I'm just not gonna deal with that, whatever it is, even though it's right in my face. So it's like it's a kind of justification, and that we don't regret that justification because we don't see that it's creating harm. So when we see and acknowledge that what we're doing creates harm, then our heart starts to open up, and then we feel this sense of, oh, I kind of feel brokenhearted about the fact that I'm creating harm and not being skillful. So then we don't try to justify it, and we do regret what we've been doing. And so then Pema continues, she believes that generosity that is destroyed, she says, is a false kind of generosity that's destroyed. So it would be a generosity that was self-serving, like in the example that, if you build a building at a hospital with your name on it, and you're supposed to be generous, donator to cancer research, so generous that you gave all this money to build a building, but really your motive was that people would read your name on the building and say, oh, isn't that person wonderful? And you reap a lot of benefit from that had nothing to do with actually being generous. So that would be an example of what she calls a false kind of generosity, and therefore that is problematic. And when you engage in that kind of false generosity, then there's no merit in that. That kind of generosity destroys your ability to gain merit in that regard. Okay, the Dalai Lama also wrote, there are many, let me tell you, there are many commentaries on Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva Way. I think I have about at least 10 of them at home. So the Dalai Lama wrote one called A Flash of Lightning in the Dark of Night. And here he writes, in brief, there are two types of merit that anger cannot destroy. Okay, so this is important. This is what cannot be destroyed. He said, the merit of realization of emptiness and the merit of spiritual qualities that come from meditation. Apart from these, the good effects of all other ordinary positive actions can be destroyed by anger. Okay, let me read that again. The merit of realization of emptiness and the merit of spiritual qualities that come from meditation. Apart from these, the good effects of all other ordinary positive actions can be destroyed by anger. So that's kind of interesting. And let me break down what it is that he's saying here. So the merit of the realization of emptiness refers to our ability to understand that things are impermanent and that they lack separate, reified existence. So that would be an example of what he's talking about, of the realization of emptiness. So that's something we talk about a lot in Zen, is this realization of the non-duality of things. And out of that realization comes compassion, because we see that while things lack inherent existence, that means that everything is interconnected, inner being, and out of that comes compassion. So recognizing that, really deeply understanding that, cannot be destroyed. And so he's saying that can't be destroyed. Spiritual qualities that come from meditation. So this is interesting because this is not a list that I would give if I were talking about Zazen. But in Tibetan Buddhism, they're doing very specific kinds of meditation with a particular outcome. So there are various techniques that they engage in. So they have various ways of talking about it. But I tried to kind of come up with the examples that he gave. I tried to come up with some that were would resonate for us as Zen students. Realizing the truth of no inherently existing phenomena or emptiness would be one way of focusing on meditational practice. Cultivating faith, considering impermanence, cultivating equanimity, realizing bodhicitta, that's the Buddha mind heart. So realizing our Buddha-ness, that bodhicitta. So the importance of realizing no inherently existing whatever, phenomena, self, is that the realization of emptiness is suchness. So suchness is this way in which reality itself is functioning. That in and of itself, this reality's functioning is not obstructed. It's not obstructed by our harmful actions. It's not obstructed by our delusion. It's not obstructed by anything. It is things just as they are, unfolding, happening. It is this life going on, this interconnectedness. So it means that if we understand this, we also understand our essential nature, and we understand that that nature cannot be tainted by our misdeeds. That does not mean that we don't have to pay attention to engaging in activities that are harmful or problematic, but it does mean that the essential nature of this self and all phenomena cannot be destroyed through misdeeds. So the things that cause us to engage, so another thing that comes out of this is we realize that the things that cause us to engage in hatred, delusion, greed, and the underlying fear are not real. They're porous. They have a kind of entryway in that porousness. So, example, if I have a neighbor and that neighbor likes to stay up late and play loud music, and that's problematic for me, it's like I may hate the fact that the neighbor does that, and I might find it very distressing. But but that doesn't mean that that's all the neighbor is. That doesn't mean, and because that's what we do, we reify that person. And so they do something we don't like, and then everything they do must be something that we're not going to like. Everything they do, they're just a bad person. They can't do anything right. It's like they pull up in their car and they make too much noise. They, sneeze in their house and they make too much noise because they're just this loud, boorish person, right? And that's all they are. And they have no good qualities, because we can do that in our minds, right? When we get upset with somebody. There are things that I find it interesting that there are things that if our really good friend said something to us like, "Oh, your hair looks interesting today," we would go like, "Oh, okay, well, maybe they aren't always the most skillful, or maybe my hair does look interesting today, and that's fine." But if somebody we don't like says to us, "Oh, your hair looks interesting today," we're like, "Uh-oh, I hate them. Look, they're criticizing me. They're saying my hair is ugly and I don't do this and that." And boy, they're always saying stuff like that. They're terrible people. I've had it with them. Okay, I'm never talking to that person again. It's like we just go to these places that are kind of like over the top. So to remember that this non-inherent existence, the way that plays out in the situation is that we remember that people are not one thing. People are many things. And that person who plays really loud music at night might be, if you knew the rest of their lives, you might discover that they are like the kindest, most generous, amazing person. You might discover that they're a famous musician and they play loud music at night, because they've just gotten off a gig at 3 o'clock in the morning. You didn't know you were living next door to Mick Jagger. You just thought some old dude was next door, right? And when you find out stuff like that, all of a sudden your perceptions change. But Buddhism is saying, well, why can't we allow for the possibility of that perception being there in the first place? That opens up and creates this kind of spaciousness in the midst of our aversion, or in the midst of our greed, or in the midst of our delusion. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, Shinshu, there are some things that just should be dealt with, right? I mean, maybe it is important for that person not to turn on loud music at 3 o'clock in the morning. Okay, yes, that's true. We may need to do something. We may want to do something, but how are we going to do it? That's the question. And if we cultivate equanimity and spaciousness, if we cultivate a kind of generosity, then when we do something, it's not out of the realm of skillful action. It becomes something that is a generous act, or something that we set boundaries in an appropriate way without needing to punish, without needing to be punitive about them. And because we punish and we get punitive when we get scared. We get punished and punitive when we think something's bad's going to happen. So we're like, we can't find that spacious mind. So patience allows us to have a kind of spaciousness, right? It's like when people say, oh, when you get upset, count to 10 before you say anything. That's creating that space. That's creating patience. So now from a Zen perspective, in relationship to this verse, unskillful action cannot destroy our essential nature, which is Buddha nature, because Buddha nature is the true state of all things. Buddha nature is suchness. Buddha nature cannot be destroyed. It can be obstructed, our expression of that truth, of reality itself. It can be obstructed by repeated and pervasive ignorance. And here I mean ignorance, not as in delusion, but as ignorance of the truth of how things are. Our ability to see that can be obstructed. And so we can be obstructed by greed, hate, or apathy, or any other variation, jealousy, or whatever it is, emotion that's a harmful or obstructive emotion. So the point is that if we are unaware of, and we continue to engage in these kinds of habitual patterns or attitudes, then we're not interrupting that cycle. So Buddhism in many ways is a lot about, it's a positive sense, our teachings are very positive in the sense of this is how things are, this is what the truth is, etc. But it's also about how do we interrupt that chain, if you will, of the habitual ways that we engage in activities that create harm for self and other. So we want to interrupt that, and cultivating patience is a way. And the techniques involved in cultivating patience are ways that they interrupt those patterns so that they create this kind of spacious entryway. So that's what Shantideva does through this chapter, is he offers us these ways of looking at the nature of our experience that create this kind of chink in our ways in which we reify various things. So in a way, we ought to take the verse very seriously, and really think about what we're up to. But we shouldn't be paralyzed by the verse, and we shouldn't feel demoralized by reading this verse, which is what happens when people read the verse and go, oh my God. I had a student say to me recently, I mentioned this about working with anger, and they said, I read this verse and it's like, I thought, oh no, I'm just doomed. I can't go, it's like, I might as well just give up. And I'm like, no, don't give up. It's not that bad, So, so we shouldn't be really put off by this. I say, please persevere. But again, we don't want to continue to plant the seeds of our delusion and here I mean delusion as in whatever is blocking us from understanding the nature of reality. And because, we know from Western psychology that generally we all grow up with some kind of something that, that is painful, some people more than others. And that creates ways that we want to protect ourselves. And I think as human beings, generally, we come up with strategies to protect ourselves. And sometimes those strategies are very workable. And sometimes they continue on in our adult life in ways that are not very workable. And so how do we kindly, gently, intelligently, with sanity, explore the nature of those things that we're doing that are not particularly helpful and heal them, or at least become aware of them enough so that they don't get in the way? Because I personally think there's stuff I'm going to die with that I will never completely work through. But that's okay, because I think that's the nature of being a human being. That's why Dogen says in Genjo Koan, right? And yet, in our aversion, weeds spread. We don't want weeds to spread. We have aversion to that, and yet somehow they keep spreading. And in our attachments, flowers fall, things die. We stay attached to them, and they keep dying on us. And it's like, yeah, that's how things work. And so, how do we work with that? How do we, accept the fact that we grieve when things die, and that we didn't want them to die? How do we work with that in a way that it is part of being a human being, and yet simultaneously, how do we work with it in a way that doesn't become harmful to self or other? How do we work with our aversion to weed spreading in the self and not harm the self? How do we work with what we perceive as weed spreading in somebody else and cultivate patience? Because it's not our job to change somebody else. Our job is to work with ourselves and the things that are problematic for our development of skillful means. So in Zen, we say we are Buddha nature, and therefore this essential nature cannot be destroyed. Can't believe it, surely. I've not lost. Here we go. Okay, so I wanted to talk about a little bit about, which I did talk about in that last talked about, I think, I've talked a little bit already here about anger creates this way of pushing things away, and also it creates fear in other people, which is one of the reasons why it's particularly problematic for people, because people become afraid. And greed and delusion usually don't have that response in people, but also greed and delusion are also very harmful kleshas. Greed is a genesis for the desire to accumulate things. So it means that you can inappropriately, you try to accumulate power, try to accumulate influence. It can be want to accumulate recognition. It can be very narcissistic. So there's a way in which this sort of greed, not getting enough, can be, if you have in this power, then you have a way in which you can be really engaged in very harmful actions. Greed can be very harmful to the self. Anger is harmful to the self. They've done studies that if you're angry, it actually clogs up your arteries and messes with your body. I have a feeling greed also messes with our bodies as well. So there's this way that all of these ways are bad for us physically, but they're also difficult for other people. The idea about not doing something when you should do something is can be quite harmful. So all of these states can be very destructive, and so we need to pay attention to them. Let's see. So in the second verse, Shantideva says, thus I should strive in various ways to meditate on patience. So I hope I've persuaded you for reasons why, we should think about, try to transform the things that get in our way, that obstruct our understanding, and transform them into patience. The activities, the techniques, if you will, that he offers about transformation in and of themselves are transformative. And what they create is this space that we want to create in our responses. And so there are various techniques about how we can do that. But at the same time, there are also techniques about cultivating compassion for each other and how we are with each other. So so this patience helps us to soothe our fear. It helps us to interrupt kind of knee-jerk or uninhibited, inappropriate responses. And yeah, so Shantideva gives us several tools to achieve that. So we have more moments of sanity and equanimity in the midst of our difficult, and it is a difficult life right now. I think we live in a stressful, fearful time. So patience is always good, but I think particularly right now, it would be quite helpful. Thank you very much.